Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome, and welcome very much to the River Room. The River Room used to be, I don't know whether it was in your time, but it was the Lord Chancellor's drawing room, and it now belongs to me as Lord Speaker, but only to be let out for worthy causes like this. But very, very welcome here indeed. And of course, tonight we've got two very special people. Meg Russell, the Director of the Constitution Unit of UCL and a leading parliamentary researcher. And she will be in conversation with my good friend and former Father of the House and former lots of other things, Ken Clarke. And Ken is going to reflect on his parliamentary career, changes in parliamentary culture, practices over the past half century, perhaps even something on Europe he might actually be tempted to talk about. It's one of a series of seminars hosted by the Constitution Unit. Some of you may know that in the House of Lords we also have a Lord Speaker's lectures where we have various extremely good speakers. So we'll audition Ken to see if he actually comes up to the standard for that. But a very, very warm welcome indeed. I mean, I'm very pleased that Meg Russell's here because it's always seemed to me that Meg is one of the serious people about House of Lords reform. And as you may have noticed, House of Lords reform has just come onto the agenda in a big way this particular week. And she has done a great deal, I think, in that area. She was the special advisor to my committee, which I set up, on the size of the House of Lords, which they produced an extremely good report under Terry Byrne. And it's that, I think, we might actually return to at some stage once we've got through some of the flaff that we're going through at the moment. All we need actually is for the government to take on the report, Meg, and we can actually motor away, but we'll see whether that happens.
You're optimistic.
Yes. How many years have we been trying to reform the House of Lords?
And I've given up believing I shall live to see the day. Everybody wants to reform it. No two people agree on how to reform it.
Well, I was quoted the other day that we are beyond now the 300th anniversary of the first attempt to legislate to limit the number of appointments put in by the executive.
Is that right?
Yeah, 1719. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we're way beyond that now, yes. Yeah. Well, we'll see what the new appointments have. Who knows? All kinds of odd people. It is alleged are going to appear in this. I can't possibly comment upon that. But I tell you, great pleasure to have Ken Clarke here. We joined the House of Commons in 1970 on the same day in adjoining constituencies. I was in Nottingham South, Ken was in Rushcliffe. Later, we joined together, much to his surprise, to the Department of Transport, which wasn't up until that moment a great interest of his, but we had a very happy, and very good and very productive time at the Department of Transport. We carried through a whole series of reforms there, and we were left entirely to our own devices as well. Quite an interesting contrast between what appears to be government ministers and how they're controlled these days and how we were controlled. We weren't controlled at all. We just put forward our proposals and got through a cabinet committee, and then off we went.
I doubt whether Margaret knew what we were doing because she never read newspapers.
No, yeah. Well, she yes, but she had been a transport minister long ago, and then we went. I went to the Department of Social Security, DHSS, Health and Social Security, and I was not particularly pleased with my inheritance in terms of ministers, so I managed to get in an elaborate exchange of transfer market. I managed to get Ken over as Minister of Health, and we worked there for another 5 years. So we've had a long history together. And what I would say about it is this. I mean, Ken has obviously had a glittering career. He's been Home Secretary, Chancellor of the Exchequer, Lord Chancellor, all kinds of other things. But the great thing about Ken is he's a tremendous man to work with. And I've never worked with a better man in the whole of my political career. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Ken here and Meg to introduce you, and also now to listen to your sharp questioning of this guy. And I do tell you one thing, you may have to shut him up from time to time. His answers do go on a bit.
I just wanted that.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Well, I should start by thanking enormously Lord Fowler, not only for that very generous introduction, but for making this beautiful room available to us for this event this evening, and to his staff, particularly Patrick and Hayley, for having helped out with all of the logistics of getting us here. The one thing that Lord Fowler didn't mention in that beautiful introduction was that this is actually not just a Constitution Unit event, this is a joint event between the Constitution Unit at UCL, which we're bothering you with things on your seats about us, clearly a research centre looking at constitutional reform and political institutions, but also the Study of Parliament group, which brings together staff at the various legislatures across the UK with researchers who study Parliament. So we're delighted to be jointly presenting this event with the SPG, and I hope that our interests sum up some of the key interests of yours, Ken, and of course we are tremendously grateful to you for being here and doing this event. Just a few words about the logistics. We will have a conversation for half an hour or so. We will then open it up to you to ask questions of our speaker. We are recording this. The conversation will be videoed and will be available on the Constitution Unit website afterwards for yourselves and the world to see. But the video camera will be switched off when we get to the question part, so don't feel inhibited in what you ask and don't feel inhibited in your answers, though I find it unlikely that you would be.
I'm notorious for being very restrained.
So, the obvious question is, Lord Fowler has indicated the extraordinary length and breadth of your career, nearly 50 years in here, and since December, not in here. How does it feel?
Well, I had told myself I should retire for some time. I mean, I first said I was going to stand again in 2015, and then Theresa called a rather unnecessary election in 2017, and I thought that was a bit quick, so I did one last time. So it's just kind of happened. And I don't regret it, because you really, one ought to tell yourself that you've reached a stage where you ought to pack it in and you've done it for long enough and you're getting a bit old for it, and not wait until your best friends start dropping hints to you that perhaps you should think of doing something else. So, no, I'm getting used to it, no longer coming into this place day by day and having the frustration of reading about it without being able to take part in it. But no, it's fine, and I'm trying to adjust to the pace of being retired a bit, at least from politics. So no, retirement's not come as a terrible personal shock, and I just got to make sure I don't relax into retirement too much. But I think political events and so on keep luring me out. I remain a political addict.
Who knows, there may be opportunities coming your way.
Well, Mr. Cummings has already announced that he was going to put me in this place, but this is what Norman was hinting at, but we should wait and see. There's all kinds of things going on that I'm sure. But anyway, there we are. There's many surprising things have suddenly happened as turns in my political career, so I shall wait and see.
And you won't mind working in York, if we're believing
I do think of all the ways of doing something about the areas of Britain that are simply not sharing in the benefits of a modern economy. Moving the House of Lords to York is one of the slightly more irrelevant suggestions. There we are. As my main home is in Nottingham, it might be slightly more convenient for me if. I don't know. I have no idea what's going on, so we should wait to see whether it concerns me directly or not.
The other most obvious question, which is a very, very general question, I think, given that, you know, the one thing that unites everybody, I think, in this room is a fascination with Parliament. Given the extraordinary length of your career in this place, or in the other place, maybe I should say, from where we're sitting now, is just how much over that period did it change? What were the key changes? Changes for the better, changes for the worse? What would you most point to?
Well, it's a totally different world. I mean, you should have got Norman and I to do a joint seminar on all this. It's the Parliament I entered nearly 50 years ago worked in a quite different way from the present one, and the political atmosphere was totally different. The people were here were on the whole a different sort of people. I mean, Norman and I were, I think, the 1970 produced a big inrush of people who were more post-war people. It was sort of a change in the former generations. In those days, the House, it was a club. It was a kind of St James club, really, with all the oddities of the other St James Club in London. Certainly on the Conservative side, a lot of knights of the Shire and grandees and country landowners doing their duty by their county, with a minority of people who were actually actively professional politicians hoping for office, the men of affairs, as it were. It sat unlimited hours. It was a club into which the ministers had to immerse themselves from the late afternoon onwards into the evening and into the night quite frequently, as people gathered, having done their main job during the day. On the Conservative side, unless you had money of your own, you earned your living doing a job outside. I was a barrister on the Midland Circuit, and I would come down to London from my trial and move in the afternoon and with any luck get the last train out of Euston to go back to my trial, and I would spend an evening in a political village with a lot of hive of political gossip, the centre of political life, but reported to the outside world and conducting its affairs in a very different way. The Labour Party was similar but different, just as we had a whole lot of landed and country gentry and ex-senior officers from the war and so on our side. They had a big group of working class trades union members. There was a miners group of 35, some of whom I knew well because I came from that part of the world. The most helpful one to me was a Labour MP who'd beaten me when I stood at Mansfield against him, which was then a mining town, and he was the only one who showed me around the building. And he was a great guy called Don Concannon. But it was a more powerful House of Commons now. The government had to take notice of it, but in a different way.
More powerful then or more powerful now?
More powerful then. We had a very parliamentary system of government. We had a very cabinet-based system of government as well. And although it was very rare to have rebellions, I was in the Whip's office in my first Parliament. Norman was my boss, as he said, for some years when I started being a departmental minister. But before that, I'd been in the Whip's office, which Francis Pym was my chief whip, and I'd been the European whip. I was one of the two whips, actually, directly responsible for the European Communities Bill, which is still quite topical, because we were joining the European Union. We did have rebellions on that. We carried that with cross-party support. But on other things, I covered other subjects. Education was one of the things I covered with Margaret Thatcher as the Secretary of State, whose bills I was trying to get majorities for. Members rarely rebelled, but if they grumbled, you took notice of them. And if some of the chaps were a bit unhappy about what the government was doing, you made to keep your ears open to pick this up and then make sure the minister had a word with the uncomfortable colleagues and reach some accommodation so that we didn't have any difficulties on the floor of the House. But it was a very strange way, very British way, in which it worked. It was a very lively Parliament, but the atmosphere was not the same as today. Everybody today is first and foremost a professional politician, they're drawn very much from sort of the meritocratically sort of educated middle-class group of society, and the media has more influence on government, and Parliament does sometimes, and when Parliament does do something, it turns into a quite highly publicised, sometimes hysterical ding-dong in the public debate. It still has powers occasionally. I mean, the fascinating deadlock of the last 3 years shows it can still just about stop the government doing things. But we will see whether steps are taken to try to ensure that Parliament and the courts stop interfering at all with the presidential powers of the government over the next few years. See whether, I very much hope not, that another step is going to be taken. But anyway, I've given you a rather broad brush, vague indication of the way in which I think it's changed. Of course, it leads more family-friendly hours. They're described as family-friendly. They were devised by Tony Blair to be more government-friendly. You knew when the votes are, and everybody clears off in the afternoon, in the evening, and they stop gossiping to each other. And so they do mingle less than they used to, and it works in a different way altogether now.
One of the things that you haven't mentioned there, when you're talking about potentially Parliament being stronger in the past, is of course the advent of the Select Committee system in the House of Commons, which when I mentioned the Study of Parliament group, I should have said actually the Study of Parliament group is more than 50 years old. It actually predates your entry into the House of Commons, which is saying something.
Well, something must.
And one of the first campaigns which the Study of Parliament group kind of gathered around was the campaign sparked by people like Bernard Crick with his book on the reform of Parliament to establish a set of specialist committees to shadow government departments. Do you not feel that that was an important change in culture and a change for the better, in professionalisation of a positive kind in terms of
it was a very drastic change
and so on?
Yeah, it was a change for the better because going back again, the power of the chamber has greatly diminished. I mean, going back to the old days, I mean, the chamber was packed for a very great deal of the time, and the chamber was the one place where it all in the end came to a head and mattered. That was beginning to diminish already. I can't remember now who the leader of the House was. It was Norman St John Stevens, I think. It was a very, very valuable reform to give a fresh platform for people to actually hold the government to account. And the Select Committee system has worked very well. And I never got involved with it because by the time it got going, I was embarked on my front bench a ministerial career, and I was either a minister or a shadow minister, so I've never been a member of a select committee. But yes, the power of the select committee, some are witnesses, and the influence that someone can have, and the very key role that a strong chairman or chairwoman of a select committee can play, that is a valuable addition to the powers of the House of Commons. And again, a big change in the way it works. I mean, it was 99% certain now. It was Norman St John Stevens in his rather brief period as leader of the House who introduced that and got it in the time of the Thatcher government.
You've already mentioned the entry into Europe in the 1970s and being a whip on that. And it is another extraordinary aspect of your career, I think, that Europe has been a bit of a theme. And you arrived just before we went in, and you left just before we came out. And you've witnessed all of the parliamentary arguments on that issue over that nearly 50-year period. I think it was fiercely contested in the 70s, wasn't it? It was fiercely contested in the 90s under John Major, and it's been fiercely contested in these last few years. I have the impression that the arguments that we've had over the last 2 or 3 years have been more bitter and unpleasant than any of those earlier arguments. But is that just sort of proximity, or do you think that's right? How did they differ?
It's a slight change in the style of debate. I mean, it is more normal for publicised debate in this country now to be more personalised and bitter, and it is, and better, I say, very media-based, that's why. And social media is making that worse. Otherwise, it's almost the one constant in my career. It has been a theme all the way through. One of the things that got me, I first started becoming a Conservative when I was a student with Norman. The little crop of us who got known as the Cambridge Mafia when we turned up here, all decided we were keen followers of the modernising bit of the Conservative Party, because the Labour Party was still stuck in the days of the post-war consensus and was less attractive, and the country needed modernising. And I often comment, it's a symmetry of my career is that I joined when controversy started about our joining the European community, and I leave as the controversies just about settled about our leaving it. And I've had the full benefit of the 47 years of membership for which I've passionately argued all my life. It has transformed Britain while it lasted. We were a bit of a laughing stock in the 1960s and a political and an economic disaster. Suez, which happened when I was a sixth former, I think was what formed my mind. That playing a post-imperial role and keeping our route to India open in this farcical fashion was not a role for us in the world. I won't repeat the quote of Dean Acheson. It may be not everywhere, but he knows it, but it's repeated incessantly as a cliche, summed up exactly where the British were. And I strongly supported Harold Macmillan's application to join. And my first party conference was when Harold was trying to defend his application to join to the dissident right-wing people in the audience at the party conference. And I've said I was a whip. The extreme right and the extreme left, the hard right and the hard left, were united in their opposition, and that's been the pattern of debate ever since. I mean, economically, we were again a laughing stock in the 60s and for quite a bit of the 70s, being left behind by the continental countries that had been devastated in the war. And because we were in the EU, because we were the leading nation in liberal economic reform, because we were more instrumental than any other European government in moving from a common market to a single market, we developed a modern, competitive economy, and our living standards have risen at times remarkably rapidly during the intervening period. But we still always had this debate. The problem when we were joining the European Union was what a few years before had been the imperialist wing of the Conservative Party. We were still our right wing, which thought our future lay with the White Dominions and with the Commonwealth, led by Enoch Powell, was rebelling and was opposed to our joining. The Labour Party, because it was rather reactionary and stuck in the post-war era, in my biased opinion, was against it officially, but the Jenkinsites and the modernising Labour people were in favour. So Enoch Powell on one side, Michael Foot on the other, led very powerful resistance to our joining, and we, helped by the Jenkinsites, actually managed to get us in. But it was, and that never ended. The traditional party political division here has never matched the European debate. Both parties have always been divided on Europe, and at every stage of proceedings we have moved through sometimes mini, sometimes more important European crises, actually unfortunately have steadily got worse because of their significance in our domestic political debate, until they finally came to this rather surprising outcome which no one foresaw, of a referendum being called on a whim again to try and resolve it and stop these debates, and leading to the final dramatic turn of events which we've all lived through in the last 2 or 3 years. But my career is European. I mean, it has been dominated by the problem, if you like, or in my opinion, the issue which was defining our role as a nation for most of the last 50 years of membership of the European Union.
I think I may be wrong here, and you were a whip, so do put me right. In the 1970s, despite the split, nobody in the Conservative Party lost the whip. In the 1990s, of course, there were a group of Eurosceptics who lost the whip. And most recently, there was a group of Brexit sceptics, you might say, including yourself, who lost the whip. So the party management seems to have changed. And of course, the people who find themselves out in the cold in the Conservative Party has completely done so.
Yeah, I mean, the right has become much stronger in the Conservative Party, and at the moment it's become a Brexit party, though I don't think that's the private opinion of the majority of the Conservative Parliamentary Party. And the left has obviously become very dominant in the Labour Party. When it comes to losing the whip, which is a rather curious process, I mean, nobody took the whip away. You only took the whip away usually for some sort of scandal or something surrounding it. In theory, you can. It's a vote of confidence to take the whip away, but my party's never been mad enough to do that. In my time, it doesn't have the totally unifying effect on the party that it's supposed to do. John Major took the whip away from about 6 or 7 of the Maastricht rebels, and to be fair, I had encouraged him and I supported him in making a vote of confidence out of the defeat we'd suffered, which would have taken us into the social chapter. We hadn't reversed it. And of course we discovered when we took the whip away that it didn't really mean very much. No one knew quite what it meant. All we'd done was rather stir up the already damaging bitterness over the Maastricht Treaty. So nothing happened except about 5 or 6 months later, with the minimum of publicity, on a day when something else was taking the headlines, the people who'd lost the whip were quietly giving it back again. And I think the recent occasion, whoever's bright idea it was to make it a vote of confidence on this very important vote to make sure we didn't leave with no deal at all, I don't think I think they probably fondly imagined that everybody would accordingly all vote unanimously, which the Conservative Party on Europe was a bit optimistic. And I think they were amazed that 21 people didn't. And so again, they quietly gave half of them the whip back within about a fortnight, and from then on it's drifted on. It made not the slightest difference to me. Neither I nor the Chief Whip or any of my other friends knew quite what the situation was supposed to be. Usually I am a Conservative. I vote with Conservative governments usually, not with the present one on Europe.
One of the curious consequences of that is if you go and look yourself up on the House of Commons website, despite having served 49 years as a Conservative,
as an independent, yeah.
You are there for posterity and in perpetuity as an independent, because that's how you left.
Well, probably. I never left the party. I had a joke conversation with the then chairman of the party at one point. We both agreed, as far as we were aware, I was still a member of the party and carried on as a member of the party. I just was not receiving the parliamentary whip. So I had to find out some other way what the business was. Well, that wasn't too difficult. So the chief whip forgot to tell me that I'd lost the whip. To be fair to him, I've joked with the chief whip about this. So I actually said it publicly. I joked about it publicly, so it's all going to be picked up outside. I think they did it electronically. Well, I don't do anything electronically. So I discovered from the newspapers that I'd lost the whip. So I joked with he's a friend of mine, which is the present chief whip in the House of Commons, and we had a rather amusing conversation about how he hadn't quite got around to telling me that I had lost the whip. But it's not a method of disciplining a party that I would recommend to any future whip of any other party. I mean Theresa had big revolts against her deal, and if she could have taken the whip away from all those people who voted to stop us leaving in March, to stop us leaving in April, by rejecting her deal.
She could potentially have disqualified the Prime Minister from standing in
Boris Johnson, yes, including Boris Johnson and about 30 or 40 others. She very wisely didn't. It was just in the end, it was just one of those funny things that happened towards the end of a quite extraordinary Parliament. The only people it made a difference to, I'm sorry to say, is it did bring an end to the political careers of some very good colleagues, only a handful of them, who were intending to stand again and whose political careers, for the time being, have been brought to an end by it. I mean, it was a rather silly way of losing Rory Stewart and David Gauke and a few others around the House of Commons, but I'm not sure it didn't achieve anything. But it's no. If you wanted to have talk the history of taking away the whip, I mean, there isn't one. It's just one of the many bizarre and unpredictable events.
One of the things that you did vote against the whip on, and I think you were the only Conservative to do so, and you were not punished for it, was holding the referendum.
I abstained on that.
To what extent did you predict?
The reason I abstained, I was furious.
Go?
I had a great row with David about it, and I refused to vote for him. But I was, at the time, I was in the cabinet. I was a member of the government. So you're meant to be unanimous, but we hadn't discussed it in cabinet, which we would have done in the old days. And I was furious when I found out about it. No, he hadn't discussed it with me because he knew perfectly well what my views on referendum were. So then I had a row with him, and then I refused to vote. And the reason I didn't vote against it was I was in the government. But I did do the public abstention bit. I sat in the chamber and glowered whilst the vote was held. And they should have sacked me. I mean, by the rules, I had broken collective responsibility and should have been fired. But they very wisely, my leader and the chief whip pretended not to notice. And we just carried on as normal. And it had no implications or effect at all. I just carried on in the government.
Did you predict the outcome? And did you predict how Parliament would...
No, nobody did. Everybody in politics and everybody in the Westminster bubble, and on both sides, just took it for granted all the way through that Remain was going to win. Farage and Boris Johnson, you could tell by the way they behaved on the night, were just as sure that Remain was going to win as people on the other side were. I had become a little alarmed because I'd probably been campaigning a little further north than a lot of my colleagues have. My political base is in the North Midlands, and in the old mining parts of my county, I had been alarmed to pick up the really rather widespread extent of anti-establishment, which meant anti-EU feeling. And I met one or two Labour MPs who I was friendly with from, safe, sort of places we used to regard as safe Labour seats in the north of England. Found one or two of those were extremely alarmed indeed by the mood of opinion they were encountering. But I'm afraid, I have to confess, it only led me to think, this is going to be a bit closer than most people think. But I sat up for the result just to see what had happened and saw Mr. Nigel Farage make his speech, concede defeat with not very much grace, say the battle continues, because none of the Remainers had the slightest intention of being bound by a referendum. And on a defiant note, it's quite impressive.
The Leavers, you mean?
The Leavers, yes. Yeah. No, the Leavers had no intention of taking any notice of a referendum. They had never had, and when Wilson held one. And now Farage made his defiant note along the theme of the battle will continue, and went to bed, and had to be woken up later to be told that he appeared to have won. From then on, we went into the rather Alice in Wonderland world that followed this utterly unexpected result, for which neither side had done the slightest preparation, because neither side had expected that we were going into a period where we were going to leave.
And indeed, David Cameron, I believe, had forbidden preparation. But
that's right, but neither of the Leavers done it. I don't think the Leavers weren't altogether agreed with each other on what leaving meant. It took some considerable time. I mean, the campaign had been fought on the basis that millions of Iranians who will be stopped coming, who are otherwise going to come in here and take our jobs, and we would have a lot more money for the health service. But there had been no debate about what kind of trading relationships we were going to have, or what arrangements on security or defence or anything else. That's why it's taken us such a long time to leave, because both the government drawing up the plans for leaving and the hardline leavers who started getting increasingly defiant and resisting some of the things about it were all steadily developing their ideas, which had not not only not spoken about, I don't think have been thought about very much until the night when the referendum result was announced.
So where you wound up was a position, not you personally, where we all wound up was a position where that decision had been taken and the implementation of that decision then passed to Parliament and government to sort out. And what resulted was a huge row, lots of tensions and pressures and fights between Parliament and government. What went wrong? Who handled that wrong? Did government make mistakes? Did Parliament make mistakes?
Totally unprecedented situation. So I suppose everybody made mistakes. I mean, I'm sure people like me were all part of the making mistakes. Because, as I've already said, nobody on either side of the argument had given the slightest thought to any of, certainly the details, or any of the practical implications of how we actually, what it meant to leave. Well, having done that, how do you set about it? And what new arrangements we're going to have. It evolved. It's why it's taken an astonishing time, over 3 years before we made a decision. The underlying constitutional problem, given the nature of the think tank that was raised this evening, was we'd never previously had our parliamentary system of government, our parliamentary democracy, faced with a direct conflict with direct democracy, democracy by plebiscite, which had confronted Parliament with what was taken to be an instruction which nobody had thought of, and which most of Parliament had campaigned on the other side. So we haven't solved the full constitutional implications of that. I mean, I took a simplistic view, no doubt. I had refused to support the idea of a referendum. I had publicly made it quite clear that I was not going to be bound by the results of the referendum. I campaigned for Remain, and given my reasons for that, and as far as I was concerned, I was not going to change my lifelong opinions because of one plebiscite. And I didn't need my constituency, by a happy chance, turned out to be a Remain constituency, which I thought it would be. But I didn't need to cite Burke's address to the electors of Bristol and all this. So when the key vote came on Article 50, invoking Article 50, which was put before Parliament at a time when we still hadn't the foggiest notion what we were going to negotiate in the 2 years Article 50 gave us. But anyway, it was brought forward as a vote, and I voted against invoking Article 50 because I thought it was perfectly obvious that I was against leaving the European Union. But I was in that misguided minority. It was then I realised we were leaving because we were very much a minority. I was the only Conservative who voted against invoking Article 50. But that we better have to. I accepted from then on, from my subsequent speeches and voting, that whatever my own wishes, we definitely were going to leave the European Union. But underlying it all was this constitutional problem. Because it was taken, this simplistic, what was wrong with this referendum, in my opinion, was this simplistic question, yes, no, in effect, Remain, leave, to a hugely complex issue covering all our relationships politically with the rest of the world and our trading relationships with most of the rest of the world and countless other subjects with no indication of what public opinion was on any of his individual questions. And so here we were leaving and debating, well, how far are we leaving and what does leave mean and what the new arrangements are, which we're still doing.
It's striking that you were one of those who worked very hard despite having voted against the trigger Article 50, who worked very hard to try and find a parliamentary compromise, to try and bring people together around a sort of softer form of Brexit in the indicative votes and so on. You came very close. Your solution came very close to reaching a majority. On that, could Parliament have done better on that? The indicative votes process was fairly chaotic. Were there procedural changes that might have helped Parliament to reach a compromise more effectively?
I think most people agree that it did produce chaotic. Chaotic's a good word for the description it produced. That's what caused all the public exasperation. They could see, all they could see, because the details were a bit of a mystery to very large sections of the public, unless you were a specialist in some areas. But all they could see was chaos and confusion and parliamentary chaos, which is what we had, and it was very difficult. The blocking of leaving, which is what the public were persuaded Parliament was doing, it was two particular groups. It was the really hardliners on both sides. And although there's no one more pro-European than me, I was one of the ones who thought that we obviously should compromise and find a basis for...
And you voted for Theresa May's deal?
Yes, as did Michael Gove, who could hardly be called. He's as much as firm Brexiteer lifelong as I'm a firm pro-unionist. Going back to the early days when I was here, the art of politics does involve a lot of compromise and pragmatism. 2 steps forward, 1 step back is how you work in a system like ours of parliamentary democracy. But the 2 groups that wouldn't compromise were the hard right and the hard left. It's a hard way of describing them, but we go back to the 50-year story. You had the European Research Group, who didn't seem to want any agreement with foreigners at all, and just wanted us to leave and find out what happened the next day when we had no legal trading or any other relationships with our neighbours on anything. And then the People's Vote campaigners, who didn't want to leave on any terms and just wanted a second referendum because obviously the public had made a mistake and they would easily win a second referendum. So the majority in the House of Commons, unfortunately, involved Boris Johnson marching side by side with Jeremy Corbyn to give a majority usually against absolutely anything, including any compromise, which would enable us actually to leave. Now, the more pragmatic people, and there were those on both sides, we had endless groups trying to plot and cross-party, some of which I joined in. It was great, quite fascinating if you're a political addict, all this going on. But if you think of trying to get together the relevant groups of rebel Conservatives, very pro-European Labour, Lib Dems, Scott Nats, Anna Soubry's Change UK, various dissident Labour people who'd left the Labour Party for other reasons, it's quite difficult to get them to agree what day of the week it was, and let alone agree on anything frightfully positive. So the only thing we did succeed in mustering a majority for, and where we did bring things grinding to a halt, was it was possible to get a majority to actually stop us leaving with no deal at all. There was a majority to stop that, but the only vote we could carry of huge significance was one which actually delayed leaving in order to stop us leaving with no deal at the end of October 2019. Probably the most unpopular thing we could have carried for the general public, because it just looked like delay again. But that's, I'm giving another long answer, but that's my analysis, I think, of the nature of the deadlock. The government had no majority for anything, but any compromise was blocked by hardline pro-Europeans, hardline Brexiteers, who marched arm in arm against any other compromise. I nearly got a majority for one thing, and when we had the indicative votes, we won't go into the boring details of this procedural nonsense and nightmare, but we were offered indicative votes once, and I had one, helped by a Labour shadow minister called Helen Goodman, that we should leave and remain in the customs union in order to have an open border in Ireland and an open border at Dover for most purposes and so on, permanent membership of the customs union. And I got Jeremy to impose a 3-line whip on his party, which most of them followed on that. But I should have got the support of the Liberals and the Scott Nats, but they backed out because they weren't going for anything that involved us leaving on any terms. So the usual combination beat us again, but I only lost by 4, got nearer to a majority than Theresa May did, and that was the nearest we got. And afterwards I could have found half a dozen Tories who should have voted with me, who chickened out at the last minute. You usually go around asking where.
I must bring these people in shortly because I promised them. But there are 2 more questions I really wanted to ask you. Maybe we could try and do these ones quickly. They preoccupy me so much. It was about the reputational damage done to Parliament as a result of this process. What we saw in the run-up to the election and what we saw in the election itself was this whole idea that we'd seen a fight which was people against Parliament, or Parliament against people. Would you agree with the analysis? The more I think about it, I think that Parliament has got the blame for something which was essentially an internal argument inside the Conservative Party. Do you think that's fair?
Well, Parliament has been losing its reputation, and political class have been losing their reputation throughout my time in politics, and it's been accelerating in recent years. So I don't think it was the referendum that started that, although I quite agree that it's reached a new peak. I mean, it is very strong now.
Some of the rhetoric has been very explicit.
Yeah, and the referendum itself, I mean, people have lots of reasons on both sides for voting yes and no. I'm not dismissing, I'm sure, people with excellent thought-through arguments for being Remainers and excellent thought-through arguments for being Leavers, but there were also people who, with all kinds of instincts that were making them vote one way or the other. And I think the Leave majority, the thing that gave them the majority is the extraordinary figures that came out of the left-behind industrial towns in the north, was anti-politicians, anti the establishment. The referendum gave them what seemed to be a free hit at expressing their rage at the way they thought people like themselves and the places where they lived had been neglected. But it had started long before that. I mean, the biggest single issue before that had damaged the reputation of politics was the MP's expenses scandal. But again, in the world in which modern media now dominates political debate, and the atmosphere in which political debate is now conducted in a very personal, very much based on personality and very much based in shock, horror, scandal, week by week. The reputation of the political class has been steadily declining, and the deadlock of the last 2 or 3 years brought it to a head. I mean, again, the election result, this brilliant slogan, "Get Brexit Done." I mean, again, it doesn't tell you anything. We don't have a policy now. It may have been announced today.
You voted to get Brexit done. Some people who are now in the government.
Yeah, but that was just a withdrawal agreement. That's a mere preliminary. Yeah. The grown-up negotiations start now. And maybe my question's been answered by the government. Today, I think, the first time, they're meant to be producing their negotiating objectives, which no one's ever produced before. But I haven't seen in what form they've been produced, because it's one of the main. We don't have any policy on what objectives we're pursuing. I mean, we didn't at the election. So I've already said we didn't at the referendum. So now the serious business starts of trying to determine what future relationships we have. But I mean, going back to where we were, the people versus Parliament, as you say, was a theme that was run by the Brexiteers. It's one of their very strong, very effective campaigning arguments at the time of the election. I mean, we shouldn't have had the election when we had, because Parliament had achieved a majority for avoiding no deal and giving time for an actual deal. And that majority, if we could only have agreed what it wanted, could have taken us through and got the withdrawal agreement. And then perhaps we could have moved on, and we would have had to have a general election, but about what really matters, which is the negotiations which are about to start next month. We'll have a permanent withdrawal agreement, comparatively minor preliminary procedural step. But unfortunately, everybody got so wrapped up with the deadlock that suddenly the Lib Dems and the Labour Party, Joe and Jeremy, had a rush of blood to the head and decided to sign a suicide note and call a general election, which Boris had been desperately trying to get for the previous 2 or 3 months. So we never discovered whether the majority we just about put together could proceed to take us through this preliminary stage and then perhaps get the parties competing for power to give some description of what they thought. I mean, the government was elected with no description whatever. I mean, for reasons I won't go into, they seem to want all the time to bring in the white dominions to reinforce the opinions of their supporters. So we're apparently going to have either a Canada-style agreement or we're going to have an Australian-type agreement on trade, which Australians don't have an agreement, but I mean, that's a way of describing no agreement. And we're having an Australian point system for immigration, but that's about as far as we got. And that's just all been made clear today in some magisterial statement, which I have not yet seen. But the underlying attitudes of the public were driving this, because anti-establishment, anti-London, anti the damn politicians of all sides, determination to express an angry protest against it all had been growing for a long time, and the deadlock brought it to a head, because those very keen in politics, I'm sure, were following every detail of the sometimes mad debates that were taking place, but the general public could see this was a mess, it was a deadlock, everybody was just going on. And so Mr. Cummings' brilliant slogans, "Get Brexit Done," was brilliant, and he very wisely, or Boris or whoever decided the strategy of the Conservative Party, did nothing to describe what it was going to get done, but it was going to bring the deadlock to an end. And
I think
that's
I should
just where
probably
we are now.
bring this to an end now.